Archbishop Jordan was so enthused by the council that he set fire to so many things. Newman College and the Western Catholic Reporter, but the parish councils, and then he had all kinds of speakers coming in talking about the council. He was also aware that we had few of any Catholic schools out in the rural areas, so he set up the rural catechists with Monsignor Fitzgerald, and then what's her name? Sister followed him. But so many things like that were happening, of course, through the diocese. And it's an interesting thing that with these catechists out in the rural areas, at one time there were at least 1,000 of them out there. And these people became the leaders in all their parishes and the liturgies and everything that was going on. So it was, for me, just a great grace to be among people like this and able to make my own contributions there.
The theme for the present year, create a climate for change, brings me way back to the seminary for me, where there was we had a priest of the diocese, one of the professors, Father Briere, and he introduced small groups in the seminary. And so it became CFM and YCW, YCS for students, and so that's my kind of initiation. Of course, I grew up in a town where there was lots of credit unions, and a long story about my journey about up to the present moment about when I was in seminary, Marian Center got started, and those kinds of things really developed, help us to understand the development of peace. I think when it came on the scene, Well, one of the things was that Bishop Neal mentioned was the catechists were going out. So that was the first time that there was reflection going out to small groups in parishes around the diocese. And that really was before development peace began, So it really introduced. I think the theme today is create a climate for change, So all that things began to and led up to development of peace and Vatican II, and so it kind of pulls together all the history of that the diocese.
I think that's the context, for development of peace. There were so many wonderful opportunities for people to be involved, and here's something practical to do. And I think of that about the time. I'm not too sure it was Pope Paul VI asked the Canadian bishops to concentrate on Latin America, to help out in Latin America, to send missionaries there, and to send resources. And this, again, fitted very well. Mm-hmm. So Archbishop Jordan asked some of the priests here to go to Latin America, where they were in Peru, whatever. But they could involve a lot of lay people because they got involved through development and peace. Mm-hmm. It was a practical way for them to show their Christianity, their concern for their brothers and sisters in need. Mm-hmm. And in a way, the whole diocese was encouraged with that. Western Catholic Reporter did that. Newman Theological College helped to train the teachers, many of the teachers. So that's the context, in a way, that development and peace could develop.
I was the national representative from Alberta. Mm-hmm. I was asked to be the national representative by Father Bill Irwin, as he was known at the time. And he was in charge of Catholic Charities as such, in the broader sense of the word. And in 1967 with Vatican II, the church all of a sudden became involved in not only the theology of the church, but what you call the social arm of the church. And so when I graduated from university in 1959, I was brought in by Father Irwin to sit on Catholic Charities, and at that time the I think the chairman was Michael O'Byrne, who was a member of our court, and I succeeded him, and all of a sudden Development and Peace developed shortly after 1967. And this is when I took a very active part in the organization and ended up being the Alberta representative, being then the second national chair of Development and Peace behind Mr. Justice Monin from Manitoba. And it was a very viable and a very interesting organization, largely because of the initiatives that were taken by a fellow by the name of Romeo Meoni. And I'd heard about Romeo Meoni before that. Romeo Meoni was one of the best lay speakers I've ever heard. Romeo, he was dynamic, and he spoke at the Basilica a number of times. But it took a different slant on things, that people could understand helping the people in the third world. And Share Lent then became a very special event during those 40 days in which there was a real endeavor to try to gain funds for those people in the third world. And we tried a different number of methods in which to do that. Not only posters, but a beautiful poster like the glory of God is man truly alive.
Yes.
And so there were some very there were initiatives which were very unique in their own way. And I can say this, that before Archbishop McNeil came here, and we had our good friend, the Archbishop from our local Archbishop, Jordan at that time, he took a very strong position in this as well as the Western Catholic Reporter. And the combination of these social changes really developed into what I thought was somewhat of a miracle within the church. Because up at that time, you threw your dollar in the plate and you said you'd given enough and that was it. And with Share Lent, all of a sudden you had to find out, you had to sacrifice. You had to think about the people in the third world. You had to think about people other than yourself. So you saw a different type of growth within the church. It wasn't just CYO, Sunday, and a few CWL and a few other organizations, but new organizations which were being developed, in which people could have a very genuine interest. And the one that I felt strongest about was Share Lent at that time.
1970, I was mission to Sacred Heart, and I succeeded Father Reynolds at Sacred Heart. He was a long time a priest in the city and the diocese. But one of the things that the theme in those days was, reflect globally but act locally.
Locally, yes.
One of the things that did change, and that was after 1967, laymen were allowed in certain circumstances to do the homilies in the church rather than the priest. And I had prepared a couple of homilies to be able to give them during Lent and during the 40 days to speak to the people in the church about Share Lent and why it was important to share amongst all of the people in the world, especially those that needed the most. Now, I must have given close to about 40 homilies. Once in a while, I would get a standing ovation. Well, the Cody Center was
Yes.
the only
Cody Institute.
institute. That was the only institute that we really knew of, other than the Marian Center in Edmonton, where you could identify an organization that was doing something that was very active and very effective within the church. And it wasn't until Development and Peace and we realized what was now being done across Canada, that really had a cell here and a cell there and a cell there, and it really had within about 5 years, had developed a network that we could be very, very proud of, which resulted in a person like myself in 1973, late in 1973, that the Pope Paul VI organized a event for all the people who were involved in similar organizations throughout the world. to meet and to see where they were going with their efforts. And let me tell you, when Maoni was there, Maoni was like the king. He was just I can't speak highly enough about this individual as to
Where
his
was
sense
that
of
held?
dedication.
Toronto?
And this was in Rome.
In Rome.
And this was in Rome. And after that, what you saw was then the breadth and the totality of the organization and how far it has spread, maybe under different names in certain countries. But you could see what was the effect when all of the countries got together with a similar organization to assist people in what we call the third world.
Issues.
Can I slip in just, Maoni was a member of the Young Christian Workers.
That's right.
And the person who picked him off the street was a fellow by the name of William Power, Bill Power,
That's right.
who became the Bishop of Antigonish later. And Maoni had very little education, but an
Grade 10.
incredible enthusiasm. And he had no problem speaking. He didn't know any French either. But he'd get up and he'd speak Italian and French and but everybody got his message. He was down to earth, wonderful.
There were some issues, weren't there?
Yes.
In with all this good news, there were still a few issues.
I grew up in Antigonish Diocese, and so the cooperative movement, credit union, the extension department started there in the 1920s, and it was Cody and Tompkins were the leaders, and they before too long they had people going out into the fishing villages and country areas and in the steel plants and the coal mines, organizing people, and they set up co-ops and credit unions and co-op housing and all that. And then when the Pope Paul VI asked the bishops to send priests and lay people down Latin America, these were the kinds of people they would send. And they would want to take some kind of training at the Extension Department and Coady Institute. Coady Institute was established in about 1959. And they trained all the people that we had that were going to Latin America. And many, many people came from the Latin American countries, especially in the Bahamas and the Central America, so the bishop at the time was Bishop John R. MacDonald, and he talked to the priests about we should have a commitment to this diocese to help out the church in Latin America, and he ups and dies. But he was working on a document encouraging the priests to volunteer. And the bishop who replaced him was his father, Bishop Power. And Bishop Power talked to the priests and said, "Are we ready for that kind of a commitment?" And they said, "Yes." So he asked me to go to the number of Latin American countries to find out where might be the most appropriate place for us to go. And they ended up going to Honduras. And they must have been 7 or 8 of the priests there, not lay people. But then some years afterwards, I'm now with a bishop, and I'm asked to go to Puebla with a big congress of the Latin American bishops. And so representatives of the United States and Canada were there. And I was one, and John Paul II made his first trip to North America at that time. And he gave his talk. And it was a real problem because of the whole notion of liberation theology. It was a confusing time. There were lots of religious communities that were trying to help the people, and when they got into something practical, it would be something like credit unions, cooperatives and whatever. And a lot of other people who maybe had a background, a different religious background, who may have been communists or whatever. And many of the clergy came from the well-educated and more wealthy part. They had little or no practical experience with ordinary people. So they were confused about all this business of working with the people. And it took a while. It was confusing there in Rome, and I mentioned a little while ago, the curious thing is most of the theologians who were active in the liberation theology were trained in Germany and France by people like
Gutierrez,
Gutierrez is one, but trained by
Ratzinger.
Ratzinger, a fellow by the name of Ratzinger. So they had solid theology, but it wasn't practical for the conditions that they had to deal with. And that caused a lot of trouble. And you know, even Pope Francis got himself, he got involved as a Jesuit leader. He didn't want to have nothing to do with it. But some of his own priests became involved with the ordinary people, and he condemned them, took them out, whatever. And he realized after a little while later, that he was wrong. And I think he's been trying to make up for it ever since, because he's gone out, you know, he sees it so important for him as a leader to be among the people. And then he can say things like, well, you know, if you want to be a good priest, then you should have you're leading your flock, then you should have the smell of the sheep from you. Practical, down to earth.